Yeah. My name is George. So I'm a PhD candidate right now at the University of Chicago. I just finished my first year, a couple months ago, I guess at this point. And I graduated from undergrad in 2020. So the application process for me is still very fresh in my mind and everything. And I applied to a bunch of programs, and at the end of the day, I was admitted to about 8 programs out of like maybe 15 I applied to. And my focus right now is on experimental physics. I guess more specifically dark matter experiments. But in any case, the overview of this presentation is first I'll talk about the landscape of admissions, just like preliminaries, things you should know. Then we'll talk about preparing to apply, because I think most of the work really is the preparation. Like finding the interest in finding your interests and finding the programs you want to apply to, contacting faculty, securing your letters of recommendation, taking the standardized tests. There's a lot of things to do before you even open up the application. So that's really going to be the bulk of what we talk about today. And then, of course, we're going to talk about what the application itself entails: the statement of purpose, the CV, and optional diversity statement. And then, of course, we'll also talk about interviews. Yeah. So before I start, this is something I tell every student when they ask me about grad school or try to talk about the subject. A lot of students will ask me sometimes like, can I get in if my GPA is this, or like my scores are that, and I think people get really worried about scores and numbers, and like I totally get that. I went through the process not too long ago. And my advice really is like the answer is always yes. Like you'll get into a program, it's not a question of like yes or no, it's a question of like really where you'll get into. I think is a better way to look at it. And I would say just don't be discouraged if your GPA is below 3.5. I mean, I know many people have gotten into like grad school with like GPAs lower than 3.5 and lower than 3. So don't let that deter you. Like I will be honest, it will be a little bit harder, but it's really not impossible. And programs, most importantly, and at the end of the day, they don't really care so much about GPA rather than like your research interests, your passion, your persistence, the letters of recommendation. Those really like matter a lot, and like in a sense can like make up for a less than ideal GPA. So I would say, to make a long story short, don't sweat about it, and just give it a good and honest try. And I should also say there's really no secret to admissions, and there's no guarantees. This can be a frustrating part of the process because there's a lot of things that can be beyond your control, right? Like funding, professors retiring, and you can't control any of this. Like you might really want to go to a school and you really want to work with a certain professor, and the school really wants to admit you, but that professor's retiring, so they say, well, we won't admit you, or like the school just doesn't have that much funding or that many spots that year, so they accept fewer students. It's and this all varies year to year, and you really don't know what's going on behind the scenes. Uh, and it makes admissions a little opaque. And again, this is frustrating. So, and I think you sort of have to contend with that. But you should take comfort in the fact that you can at least craft the strongest application you can, and then everything else is sort of out of your hands. So I think that's a good way to look at this. And again, like I said before, most of the work is preparation, and we'll discuss how to effectively prepare a strong application when you apply. And one other thing I should talk about is the admissions committee. So I'm talking a lot about like the professors and like, how they review these applications. I think it's important to know like what's actually going on behind the scenes a little bit. So generally what happens is there's really like a committee of professors who review your applications, which is called the admissions committee or the AdCom. And generally speaking, of course it's different by every school, but generally speaking, they can solicit the opinions of faculty who are outside the committee. So this is why people will give you the advice, and I'll give you the same advice, that it's really important to make contact with faculty at an institution and mention them in your statement of purpose. Because if you mention, a certain professor, then the admissions committee can like forward your application to that professor and say like, what do you think of this student? And if that professor wants you in their group, then like that can really like push, they can like really push for you, and that can, really help your chances of admission. So that's why it's really important to, make contact with faculty and like mention them in your statement of purpose. And we'll talk about that, in due time, but I guess I should just mention it now. And I think it also helps it also helps when you prepare your application to consider what the admissions committee wants to see. And they're basically trying to answer one question. This is like what's going through their minds when they're reviewing these applications. And that's, do you have the ability to conduct graduate level research at our school with one of our faculty? That's the question. Again, like when you're doing a PhD, like the end goal is right. The end goal, right, is your thesis, your dissertation, the research that you want to do, right? Like it's not classes or like any of that, right? So they're looking at all the things that you provide in your application to see, like, can you be a competent researcher at our school with one of our faculty, most importantly. Because you can do amazing research, but if there's nobody there that's doing the sort of research that you want to do, then like that's not good. And I should also mention a lot of preliminaries here, but I should also mention the effect of the pandemic. So I think last year admissions was very, very tough. I knew a lot of students, like very bright and like, they put together really strong applications, but they didn't find so much success because, a lot of schools basically cut spots because, they didn't have as much funding that year. Again, this is one of those things that's out of your control. I think that situation is going to get better this year, but I can imagine, like some schools, like this is still going on. And so I think it's good to be aware that, it still might be a tough year to apply, generally speaking. So my advice in that regard is you should cast a wide net. That means apply to a bunch of different schools. I don't mean apply to like 50 schools because that's not practical or efficient, honestly. But casting a wide net is good because if you apply to a few programs, then like it's possible you might not find so much success. And I think another good piece of advice is it doesn't hurt to apply to jobs in your field, because that can be a backup, or if things don't pan out, you still like can find a job, doing something similar to what you want to research in. And I know a lot of people who apply to jobs alongside grad school, and like they took a gap year or like they just decide not to go to grad school at all. So I mean, I think having more options is better than fewer, honestly. I think that's the way I approach things. So that's my recommendation to you. All right, so now we're going to talk about, like the meat of everything, like how to prepare to apply and what that entails. So my big piece of advice is that you really should keep organized from the start, because there's so many things that go into every application, and if you don't have a way of tracking all of these things, it's gonna be overwhelming, so I say keep a spreadsheet of programs and faculty that you're interested in, and this will really make things a lot easier for you. Because generally speaking, you might have 3 to 5 faculty that you're interested in at each school. Again, generally. So if you're applying to a bunch of schools and there's 3 to 5 at each school, that like quickly becomes a lot, and you're gonna forget people. So spreadsheet is like really important. And use it to keep track of deadlines. When is each application due? What does each school require? Do they require the GRE subject test, the TOEFL, etc.? And of course, whether you've submitted the applications or not, the results, because then it can make looking at everything at a glance much easier when you're making a decision later on. And one other thing I should talk about is interests. So a lot of students ask me about this, like how do you find your interest, and how specific do you have to get? And I think this is difficult when you're in the physical sciences, because I think in undergrad, generally speaking, you don't get a huge overview or a huge picture of what physics looks like. You do a really standard curriculum in undergrad, but you don't really get a taste of what's going on in the field, or what are the questions that people want to answer, right? So, people have like a lot of diverse and broad interest when they apply to grad school. They're like, I want to do this and I want to do that, but like, you can't really apply saying, you want to do everything, right? Because you have to show some sort of focus in what you want to do. So this is tough, and like I went through this as well, right? Like I came up against senior year and I was like, oh my goodness, like what do I want to study? So the way I say this is that like you don't have to like focus so much, right? When you're applying, you should show that you have some focus. And this is like my own terminology. I totally made this up, but you should like be specific enough to like the point of a subfield, which I think is in between a subfield, like condensed matter physics, particle physics. Like a subfield is those sorts of things, and then on the extreme end of specificity, you have like a question, like like a specific research question that someone like dedicates their entire career to answering. You don't want to be that specific. You want to be somewhere in between. A subfield I would say is like maybe a set of questions that are united by some common thread. I guess for me, I'm really interested in like, just to give you an example, because I think it's just quite abstract. But for me, I'm really interested in tabletop experiments where people are using this new paradigm of like really small experiments to answer like questions of fundamental physics. I think, if you have something like that level of specificity, it shows that you've thought about things quite a lot. But again, it's not too specific that you're like, too specific is not good either, because then, it's when you're applying, you might exclude like a lot of professors or that you might be interested in working with. So then, okay, that's cool. And the question is, okay, how do you like find that sort of like subfield that you're interested in? So I really recommend that you sit down, like, for some time and like, honestly, just like browse the web and see what you find, and just like do some reading on the field so that you can like really like narrow down your interest. And the things I recommend are looking at the archive. I mean, almost every paper now in physics is posted on the archive. There's new papers daily, and it's like sorted really well, so you can like go through and see what's going on. Totally, I 100% recommend the archive because that's like the latest and greatest research. And honestly, talk to your professors, your letter of recommendation writers, those people who they know what the field is like, so they can give you some good advice on like what's going on or like what they think is interesting. So I think their perspectives can be pretty valuable. I also think looking at past conference abstracts is pretty helpful. Just Googling keywords and then like adding conference at the end, and you can usually find some really interesting conferences that go on, and you can read their abstracts, see what's going on. There's conferences in like really every discipline of physics, so I recommend that. And also academic Twitter. I think a lot of academics and professors, faculty, grad students, they're on Twitter. They talk about their research, and you can find a lot of people on there that are doing really amazing work, and you can honestly connect with them or just read what they put out there. So I think all of these are good ways to find out like what you're interested in, and it's a good way to narrow down your interests so that when you apply, you can show that you have some sort of focus. All right. So the next thing to talk about is finding programs and faculty. So honestly, there's like hundreds of programs in the United States in the physical sciences. How do you find like the programs you want to apply to? Because out of those couple hundred, you have to choose maybe like 10, 15 that you want to apply to. How do you do that? So my advice is go backwards. Because I think the naive way to do it is you just Google like a random school, and then you look through the faculty list, and then you look at who's doing work that you're interested in. That's really inefficient because you're gonna have to go through dozens and dozens of schools before you maybe like find someone doing something that you want to do. So I think the best way is to go backwards. Start from what you're interested in, and then find the people that are doing that sort of thing, and then look at the schools that they're based at. That's the most efficient way of doing it. That saves you time, and it'll make choosing programs really a lot easier, I promise you. So this obviously comes after you find your interest. Once you find your interest, just Google keywords, and you'll find those people. And I think a good way to other good ways to like find these programs are honestly, again, looking at past conferences, like see who's doing interesting research at these conferences and look to see the schools they're based at. Look at the archive, where, the interesting research at on the archive, like who's doing it, where are they based at, Google. And I think Nature and Science are also really good for this as well. They have really great pop science blogs, or rather they have a lot of blogs that are aimed at explaining science to a more general audience, and you can find a lot of interesting research from there. And of course, it's like, the latest and greatest science. So those are really good for that purpose as well. So basically just use all these things and then go backwards. That's really the key thing, because otherwise you're just going to be spending a lot of time trying to find programs and faculty in it. You just might come up short trying to find a good list of programs or faculty. Right. Then there's the question of how many places should you apply to? So you really can't afford to be picky, because again, there's so many programs, they all offer so many different things that it's not worth it to apply to places that you don't want to be at. And I think it's also fair to choose these list of places based on non-academic factors as well. because you don't want to be at a school where you maybe there's cool research, but you really don't like it. Because look, grad school, even in the best of circumstances, is difficult. So if you choose a place that like you really don't like and it's difficult, it's going to be a very, very tough time for you in grad school. So you want to really pick places that you think you'll like, you know. And I mean, you can pick places on things like geography, you know, like are they in a city? Are they in a more rural or suburban place? Like which coast are they on? You know, are they like close to friends or like family? Those sorts of things. You know, I would say don't be too restrictive, of course, but I think these are good things that you can use to cull your list of places because you might end up finding like a lot of places, and you know you have to like cut that list down somehow. As for a number, I would say like anywhere from 8 to 15 is common. I think it has increased in recent years because you know, like I guess the general trend of admissions really across the board in STEM is that things get more selective, so people apply to more and more schools. But I really don't apply more than 15 because like even 15 is like a bit much, and then more than that is just going to be like really a lot of time and effort, especially if you're in your senior year or taking classes. Balancing all that on top of your classwork is really going to be difficult. So I would say no more than 15. You know, and again, don't be afraid to like really cut your list. And also only apply to schools where there's actually faculty doing stuff you're interested in. Like, and I would say like 3 or more faculty that you're interested in because, you know, because less than that doesn't give you much to work with. You know, if there's only 1 person or 2 people, then like if something happens to them, like they retire, they move, you know, and like people move all the time, then you're going to be left there with like, you know, not not too many people doing the sort of work that you're interested in. So that's a very, very important thing to consider. You have to pick schools where there's actually a decent number of people doing the work that you're interested in. And you know, I'm just reiterating, you know, because I think it's worth saying multiple times, a wider net is better. Casting a wide net is good. And you know, once you find these programs, record the deadlines and in the spreadsheet because again, that's important. You don't want to like because they're all different, you know, like with undergrad, everything's due like, you know, the beginning of January. But for grad programs, that some of them can be due in like the end of November, some can be due in December or January. It all differs. So you really want to like have a handle on that. And I would also recommend once you find the faculty that you're interested in, take short notes on what each one is doing. Like what are their research projects? You know, and they'll have a list of those on their website. Like maybe a link to 1 or 2 recent publications that you think are interesting. You know, and like maybe like lab members. So just so you can contact them. And we'll talk more about that at some point. All right, well, that point is now. So contacting faculty. So why should you contact faculty and how do you do that? So again, the reason you should contact faculty is because they can influence the admissions committee. If you make a connection with people and make a good impression on them, then like when you send in your application and the admissions committee asks that faculty, like, what do you think of this application? You know, they'll remember like, oh, you know, like we had like a Skype chat a couple months ago, and you know, this person seems interesting. I would like them in my group. So you want to make that connection so that they can push for you at some point. You know, like obviously all idealized. But yeah, that's really the main thing. And the second reason you should do it is because it's also an opportunity to learn more about the work. Because look, lab websites are good. They detail a lot of the work they're doing, but you know, they're not always up to date. And some professors particularly are not very good about updating their websites. And sometimes professors have like a lot of new projects or new projects that they're working on that are like, you know, just not on the website, right? Because they're all like tentative, up in the air. And it's good to get an idea of like what their future vision looks like, right? You know, what's the research going to look like in 1 to 2 years? And you're going to be there for 5 years. So getting an understanding of what the future work looks like is very important, right? And you also want to ask them just straight up if they're going to take more students or if they think they're going to take more students. Because again, some people just might not have funding, you know, and so they might say like, you know, they're not going to take any more students for however many years. So that's really important to know before you apply to a place. So I say it's good to email these people and ask to set up a video chat. And when you make email faculty, it's really important to just make your emails concise because they do get a lot of these emails from students and they do make the time to talk to students, which I think is very nice. But if you send like a really long email, they're really not going to read it, or like sometimes they just might not respond. So just make the email really concise and tell them exactly what you want. And I would say it's also worth it to contact grad students. Obviously there's like a trade-off here. You can start contacting so many people to get like an idea of all these schools, but then like it ends up eating up your time. So use your time wisely in the end. Like contact a faculty, like maybe if there's somebody you're really, really interested in, contact like one of their grad students and just ask their opinion. Like, how's the work? What is the work-life balance like? Do they have like any I don't know. Grad students will really give you the lowdown on what everything's like. If they don't like their advisor, or they think their advisor's not a great person to work with, they'll tell you and they'll be honest about that. So if you're really interested in someone and really want to know like what the day-to-day of working in their lab is like, again, it's good to contact grad students. But I don't think it's worth it, to contact all these faculty and all the grad students or whatever. It's just honestly too much. And this is just an example email. You can skim this, but you see, it's really short, right? It's just like, hey, I hope this email finds you well. My name is blah, blah, blah. I'm a senior in physics major. I read your paper. I'm very interested in your work. And, you know, you mentioned a little bit about your experience, just to give them an idea of like, your qualifications. And then you tell them you're applying to the school and that you want to join their group. So this is really concise, like everything they need to know in one paragraph. And then, the last two sentences, last couple of sentences, you just say like, hey, I want to talk. And here's my CV, so that you can read more about me. You can like copy this format if you want, or you can just write something your own. But the important thing is just make it really concise, because like you can send like 4 or 5 paragraphs and I'm telling you they're not going to read it, or they're just not going to email at all, to be honest. So the shorter the better. Okay. So one other thing we should talk about is letters of recommendation. So who should you ask for the letters and how many? So the majority of schools ask for 3. Very rarely do they ask for 2. So, I would say, so it's important to get like 3 letters of recommendation, because very few ask for less than 3. And a lot of schools will let you add an additional 4th letter of recommendation if you want. But the important thing is, if you do add a 4th letter of recommendation, it should also be strong. Like it's bad to have 3 strong letters and then one that's like not so strong, because it really quality over quantity is what I mean to say. So the people you should ask, always ask your research advisors. Anybody that you've worked with, ask them and get letters from them. If you had like 2 PIs on the research experience, it's totally fine to ask both of them for letters of recommendation. But like really anybody who advised your research, get a letter from them. And what's really important is that it should be signed by the research advisor / professor. It like say if you were supervised by like a postdoc or a grad student, you don't want the letter to be signed off by them, because these admissions committees want to see these letters that are signed by faculty. So if you think these like a grad student or postdoc who advised you has a better idea of what you're like compared to the professor, it's fine to ask them to write the letter but have the professor sign it. But you should never get the letter and then have the postdoc or grad student sign it. You always want the letter to be signed by the professor / like the leader of the research group. That's really, really important, because it gives it like that authority. And when you ask these people for letters, just be honest and say like, I'm applying to this program. Can you write me a strong letter? And that gives them a bit of an out, so that they don't feel compelled to write you a less than ideal letter. So you ask that and they'll either be like, yeah, I can write you a strong letter, or no, I don't think I can write you a strong letter. So that's really important. You want to know they can write you a good letter of recommendation, because these are really important, because they tell the admissions committee what you're like, what your potential is like, et cetera, et cetera. And there's things you can do to like make sure these letters can be strong. And one thing I recommend is that you start compiling your CV and you start drafting your statement of purpose early on, so that you can send them to these faculty, to your letter writers, and that way they have a good idea of your accomplishments. They have a good idea of what your interests are, why you're interested in that school, et cetera, and they can tailor the letters of recommendation based on that. So it depends on the professors. Some will say like, I don't want to see it, but most of them will be like, yeah, sure, send me those things so I can like really make sure the letter is strong. And one other thing you should know is that you can ask your letter writers to address any weaknesses in your application. So what I mean by this is, a lot of students ask me, I had like difficult circumstances in undergrad, like I had to work to support my family, or I had like medical issues, and because of that, like my GPA wasn't as strong, or other things happen. So how do you bring that up in the application? You can bring it up in the statement of purpose if you want, but that's really not the place to do it. Really, the best way to address those things is to talk to your letter writers about them and ask them to address those things, because when letter writers talk about these sort of things, it's coming from a place of authority. So it's, I guess to the admissions committee, it sounds like it's more convincing when the letter writer is like, the student experienced difficult circumstances, but despite that, they like overcame those obstacles, et cetera, et cetera. It sounds more convincing coming from them than from you, to be honest. So if you're comfortable telling your letter writers those sorts of personal circumstances, I really, really recommend that, because they can really advocate for you in those letters, and that can really help your application. And again, if you're worried about GPA, this is a really, really good place to address that in your application. So the next thing we should talk about are the tests. So if you're applying to a PhD in physical sciences, the two tests that are relevant are really the GRE and the physics GRE. So most schools will ask for the GRE and the physics GRE, or maybe some other relevant one like the chemistry GRE. Like everything I say here just applies to that as well, but nothing changes that. So again, things have been changing in recent years. Schools have been pushing to get rid of these exams, and especially because of the pandemic, which made taking these tests in person like very like impractical. A lot of schools just made them optional, or just said like, we're not going to take these at all, even if you have them. So what I recommend is that when you have a list of programs, check what they're all doing. See, like, are they taking the GRE? Are they taking the physics GRE? Are they making them optional? Are they like not taking them at all? It's important to see, what's going on with those programs, right? Because if a lot of your programs are asking for them, then like it's worth it to take it. But if the vast majority of them are not taking it, then it's just not worth it to take those tests and spend time studying for them, honestly. And again, people get worried about scores and whatnot. And again, I understand that. I was there. My advice is you really don't need to do perfectly. I certainly didn't. Like I took it twice, didn't do super hot both times, but things worked out. It's not the most important part of your application, and like, especially because of last year, like it's really not the most important part of the application. It's pretty much close to the bottom. Like, a strong score does help, like undoubtedly, but again, not the most important part. And the GRE, both the regular one and the physics one are honestly kind of expensive. So let me give you some tips and tricks about that. So the physics GRE is generally offered 3 times a year. The 2 most relevant times are September and October. And one thing I will say is beware of schools that ask for unofficial score reports. And I say this because if they ask for an unofficial score report, then you can't get out of like reporting it. So you really have to send it. So just beware of schools that do ask for like unofficial score reports. Because if you do, so the thing is, if you take it both times and you do better one time, then like via the like official score report, you can just report the best score, right? Like that's very, that's a thing they offer, which is really nice. Because if you do badly the first time, do better the second time, awesome. You can just send that better score. But if they ask for that unofficial score report, then like they're going to see both scores. So like that's something to keep in mind. And it's actually important to sign up for both if you intend on taking it. And why do I say this? I say this because by the time that you get the scores back from the September test, it's going to be way too late to sign up for the October test. And like the ETS intentionally does this to like get more money out of you. So the way I recommend it is like honestly just sign up for both. And if the September score comes back and you did great and you're happy with it, cancel the October test and you'll get 50% back. Again, so like not ideal, and like it's a lot of money. But if the schools that you're applying to all require the physics GRE, then it's worth doing all this. And it's also worth noting that like you can get 50% fee waivers from the ETS, but they're first come first served, and like there's certain like qualification. There's a certain like eligibility requirements. It's not available to everyone, unfortunately. But if you are someone who qualifies, it's really worth it, because again, it's an expensive test, so 50% off is pretty nice. And one thing I recommend is that Columbia University, their astronomy department can actually pay for the physics GRE for you. And their only condition is that like you promise, like, just like on your word, honestly, that you apply to their astronomy program. So this is really cool. It's a nice initiative. So like if you're a little tight on money, because again, it's an expensive test, I really recommend checking this out. Like just Google like Columbia University Astronomy Physics GRE. Because if they pay for it, and like the only condition is that you apply to the Astro program, you basically just saved a bunch of money. And I recommend the Yanni Khan study guide. That's a really, really good study guide for the physics GRE. It basically covers everything. And the official GRE guide for the ordinary GRE is like really all you need. You don't need to like look at any other books, in my opinion. And one other test that we should talk about is the TOEFL slash IELTS. So you need one of those if English is not your first language. And of course, there's exceptions. Like, did you do your undergrad in the US? Did you live in the US for a certain period of time, et cetera, et cetera. So like if you hit any of those criteria, then you don't have to take the test. So, and each program has like different requirements. Some will be like you have to have lived in the US for like 3 years or 4 years. It depends on each program. So just check. And schools are very transparent about what minimum scores they want for the TOEFL slash IELTS. So check those again because, if you get like below a certain score, then, they just won't let you apply or like they won't accept your application. So that's really important to check if you do indeed have to take the test. All right, so that was a lot of talking about like just the preparation aspect. So the next couple of things that we'll talk about are really the application itself, like the CV and the statement of purpose. So the CV. So, there's always this question of like, what makes a CV different than a resume and how do you make a strong CV? So the difference between a CV and a resume is that a CV just has no page limit. A resume is typically 1 page, maybe 2 pages. A CV is really something that you update throughout your career, and it basically details every single thing you've done in your academic career. And once you're a senior academic, this is something that can be dozens of pages. So most schools will ask for a CV when you apply. And considering that we're all like really early in like our careers, like undergrads or just recently graduated, it's really not going to be that long. But writing a good CV now is will make your life easier if you do continue in academia because then you can just add to it and you don't have to rewrite it at any point. So I think the relevant sections at this point in your life are really education, like where did you go to school, GPA, scores, etc. Honors and awards, work experience, research experience, any publications or presentations if you have them, and any relevant skills. And you can also add outreach to that. So writing a strong CV, it's not just like a list of what you did. It's obviously more than that. But the way to really make your CV strong is pay attention to the verbs that you use, because the verbs that you use will really give a strong. If you use the proper verbs, it can really give a strong impression, and it will really, really help your application. So what I mean by this is use verbs so that you emphasize your role, what you learned, and what you did. And pay close attention to the way things are listed and described. So this is just one example from my CV before I updated it and after I updated it. So bad example, this wasn't that great, but I made a feedback controller for some quantum computing experiment. That tells me nothing about like if you're on the admissions committee, what does this tell you? This tells you nothing about what I did. I just said, okay, I made a feedback controller. That can really mean anything, right? Like made is generally a bad verb. You want to stay away from that in your CV because you want to stay away from generalities and hone in on specificity. So here's the good example. Designed and assembled some electro-optic modulator, for producing entangled photons. Yada yada. So this is nice because this is way more specific. I'm talking about what the experiment is. I'm talking about my role. I designed and assembled something. I'm talking about what, and you can infer what I learned. Like this is like this is electronics, this is circuitry, this is like quantum mechanics, this is quantum computing, and I tell you very like in very plain words what I did. So this is a much better example compared to the one before, right? And it's not like too long. So it's also important to be concise because you can write a paragraph for every bullet point in your CV, but that's not gonna make a strong CV for sure. And one other thing I recommend students do is if it's possible, because you can't do this for everything, because some things you just can't, but if it is possible, you should quantify things. But again, not required or necessary, or sometimes even palatable. But numbers are great because, people love numbers and they love seeing like improvement, etc. So, for example, like through the device I created, efficiency increased by 50%. Like, wow, if you just said like the efficiency increased, that can mean anything, right? Like it could be like a small amount or a big amount, right? But if you give like a really concise number like this, that again, strong impression. Or, if you like want a scholarship, say like I was one of 50 finalists chosen from an applicant pool of 5,000. Like, these numbers really make an impact on people because, they read these things and they're like, wow, this person did all these things and those numbers stick in their head. And one other thing I'll say is, again, be concise. These are bullet points. You can't just like go on and on in the CV, right? Like everything has to be short. And also don't be humble. Like the worst thing you can do is be humble because like this is your place to brag and like talk about what you did and all your accomplishments. Like if you did something, like own it. And you need to own it because there's like all these opportunities are going to be open to you like if you have a strong CV. So in order to have a strong one, like really like talk yourself up and talk about what you did. And also just like technical note, but always send your CV in a PDF format just so like everybody like on any device people open it on, it'll just look the same, right? Like if you send it in a doc or something, like if somebody doesn't have the right font installed, it might look wrong or like things are misaligned, etc. So just always send it in a PDF, and that's the most professional way to do it. So that's really it about the CV. And the next thing that we'll talk about, and this is really one of the most important parts of the application, is statement of purpose, or just SOP for short. So what's the statement of purpose? How do you write a good one? What can you include? So there's really a lot to say about this, and I'm going to be spending like quite some time talking about this for good reason. So a good statement of purpose is the best way to prepare a strong application. And I will say it's a narrative. A narrative like a story, right? But it's not like the Common App. So, when you apply for undergrad, when you write the Common App, you talk about your life, you talk about like your personality, like your upbringing, etc., those sorts of things. And you got to be like really open and honest and vulnerable about your life and such. But that's not what to do here. Like the statement of purpose is a much more professional, like objective document about like your work and like your research interests. And it's not so much about your life. So that's really the key thing to keep in mind. Like one thing that you should not do is just like talk about your life or your childhood and things like that. And I'll talk about that, I guess, a little bit more down the line. But the 4 things that you should cover in the statement of purpose, and that again will make it strong, are 1, what's the work that you've done? 2, what are your research interests? 3, why that particular program? And 4, what are your contributions going to be to that program? So statement of purpose, 2 pages max. I mean, it depends on, again, like I say this so much, it's maybe you're annoyed of hearing me say it, but it again depends on the school. Some schools will, say like, okay, 1,000 words. Other schools will say like, they just won't give you any guidance. They'll just say like, okay, just submit a statement of purpose. But if they don't say anything, then I just say take that to mean like 2 pages max, because any more than that, and again, it's like just a little bit too long. And if you write something that's 2 pages, then you can easily cut that down to like something like 1,000 words. It's not going to be too difficult. So I just say write one for 2 pages, and then if any program wants something else, just modify as necessary. So the big don'ts. So there's actually a study that came out a couple years ago that was pretty influential, and or maybe not influential, but it was an important study that talked about what do grad committees hate seeing in applications, or what do they think most negatively affect an applicant's application. And people talked about like a bad statement of purpose. And the particular things that they mentioned are these. So the first is when people talk about their childhood. Again, the statement of purpose is really like a professional document. Like you're finished undergrad, you're about to enter grad school. So you shouldn't talk about your childhood. Like talk about your research interests, talk about, like your course, talk about your research interests and what you want to do, like the questions you're interested in tackling, those sorts of things. Like there's no room to talk about your childhood, and like nobody cares about like what inspired you like as a kid to study physics, like just honestly speaking. So really stay away from that. Like don't mention childhood whatsoever. And like I've actually seen like when I was applying, I remember I saw one school that explicitly said that like in their prompt, like don't talk about your childhood. So this is really like I really cannot emphasize this enough. And second, is, and I think this is more of an unfortunate stigma than anything. So when I mention this, I only mention this to say, like, this is an unfortunate thing that the admissions committee believes, so that and so you should be aware of this. And I think it's just like a sort of a harmful attitude, honestly. But a lot of admissions committees don't want to hear about mental health, to be honest. People talking about their mental health struggles can leave a bad impression. Again, I think it's an unfortunate reality of like the mental health stigma that you know like is present in society. Um, so yeah, I would say stay away from those things. And if you really want to talk about mental health or like health issues that impacted you, I would say don't mention that it's a mental health thing. Just say it's like a health issue, because at the end of the day, it's a health issue. It's a medical issue. Just say like you had some medical issue that affected your life and like it negatively impacted your grades or such. You don't have to give detail. And you don't have to keep it long either. Just say like one line about that, and I think that's a good way of addressing it. But don't say it's a mental health thing. Yeah. And also say confidence is important, but not too much. Like we're all again like still early career academics and such. So don't be too braggy about what you've done. But do talk yourself up, but don't do it too much. So yeah, and again, the study found like talks about these, and like you can actually find the study that did this if you Google like graduate school kisses, like quote kisses of death, because that's what they called it. It's a little dramatic, but I think it's good to read that document just to see like what are some of the things that you should watch out for when you apply. But I think these are really like the most relevant things, to be honest. Okay, so writing a good statement of purpose. All right, so let's tackle that. So I think the first thing to say is really like your first draft is just honestly not going to be great. Like, it's really not. Like my first one was very bad. Like it was just too long and it was like meandering. And like I sent it to some people and they're like, yeah, you're really gonna have to change this. So I think it's good to let yourself go of the attitude like, oh my gosh, I have to write like so I have to put solid gold down on paper when I write this. Like that's not gonna happen. Like, you're gonna start with something, you might trash it, or you might like actually write something kind of decent and like refine it, but it's not gonna be great. Any case. Patience is the key, write a bit, put it away, for like a day or two, come back to it and work on it. Like if you just work on it continuously, like you're gonna write yourself into a rut and you're like not really gonna have like any creative ideas about how to approach it. Just like, spending time away from writing is a good way to come back to it with like a fresh mind. Because you'll come back and you'll be like, oh yeah, like I know where to go with this. So I think that's really important. And that in turn means that it's important to start early. Because if you start early, then you have the luxury of spending time on the statement of purpose. If you start late, then you're like, oh my goodness, like I need to write this in a week. You don't have that luxury of like taking time away from it. And again, at risk of sounding like a broken record, like I've said this so many times, but again, be concise, especially in the introduction. Like you want to hit them with like the important stuff, like who I am, what I want to do, like why your program, that sort of thing. So okay, we'll actually go through this section by section because again, I just think a good statement of purpose is like really, really important. So in the introduction, you want to introduce your interests and why that program. And I think it's good to think of it almost like an academic essay. The introduction is your thesis. It's telling you what to expect in the rest of the essay. And the rest of your statement of purpose should be aimed at like tying back to the intro. Again, like this should be something cohesive. This is just something from my like statement of purpose that I wrote like when I applied. Just kind of generalize it a little bit. But yeah, basically I just said like, okay, in the past few decades, particle nuclear physics have become increasingly interdisciplinary as researchers draw on techniques across subfields to study yada, yada, yada. I will pursue my PhD in experimental particle physics to search for new fundamental physics at the precision frontier. All right. So basically there I hit you with like what I want to do, like what's my interest in the second sentence, like no fluff. I'm going to pursue my PhD to search for this. And then you want to address why that program. And so in the following sentence, I say, pursuing my PhD in physics at yada yada's new Center for Precision Physics will provide me the training needed to develop my skills and conduct independent research. See, so like there, I'm telling you why that program, because they have this new center, and that new center is going to teach me all these skills so that I can be a researcher. So, and again, this is concise. This is only 3 sentences. I'm not saying it needs to be 3 sentences, but again, address those questions and don't spend too long on it. So the next part of it is really like the meat of it, the body paragraphs. So here you're going to discuss your previous experience, research, and classes. So I think if you've done research, that's what you need to discuss. You need to discuss the experiences that you've had and what you've learned. Describe what the experience was. What were the hardships and difficulties you overcame? What did you learn? And what's its relevance to your future work and interests? Again, tie it back to what you want to do, right? Like, what are your interests and why that program, right? Like, maybe this experience showed you like, oh my goodness, like I really love particle physics, and like that's why I'm really interested in pursuing like, precision physics at like this school's center or this school's program. So always find a way to tie what you did in the past to what you're doing now / what you want to do in the future. Because if you just discuss like what you did in the past, like that's okay, cool, you did all that, but like how is that relevant? And I think that's always what you should be thinking about. Like, how is this relevant to the admissions committee? All right. So body paragraphs. So when you describe your work, situate it in the larger scheme of things, ensure that you understand the role your work played. This is a criticism I've seen a lot of professors give about statements of purpose. A lot of students will just like say what they did, but it's not entirely clear those students understand what was the work they did. Because when you're an undergrad, you're usually given like maybe a very small role in a particular experiment. And if you don't show that you really understand what the experiment was, then you're basically just saying like, okay, I just did some work that someone told me. You don't want to like give off that impression. You want to show that like I understood what I was being asked to do and like how it fits into the larger picture. And I think a good way of doing this is using what's called the funnel technique. It's basically because you go from general to specific. So like again, example from my statement of purpose. Okay, I spent the summer of 2018 at CIT working with this professor on this thing, which is a quantum network based at Fermilab. Okay, that's like very general. And then I said, okay, FQNet is a platform for conducting quantum network R&D and for studying questions of fundamental physics. Okay, and then at CIT we can commission an entanglement source for the experiment. To this end, I designed and assembled a feedback controller. Okay, so sorry to read all that because I know you can just like read it off the slide, but I'm going from very general to specific here, right? Like I'm giving the very broad of the experiment. Like this is a big collaboration that's based at Fermilab that's doing quantum network stuff. And for that, we need quantum entanglement. For that, we need some feedback controller. Okay, so this is a good way of demonstrating that you really understand where your work is, what your work is doing for the larger experiment. Because again, it's really important to show that you understand what the experiment was and what the physics was. Because if you're just like doing whatever, if you just give the impression that you're just doing what someone else tells you, that's not a good impression to make in a statement of purpose. Next thing to discuss is the challenges. So you want to discuss what you did on the project and the challenges along the way, as well as how you persevered or solved those problems. And just really briefly mention your results. Because you want to show the committee that because like in all research, you're always going to experience troubles and like things are never going to go the way you want to. So you want to show them like, yeah, I had trouble as well, and like I still overcame those. That's really important. So an example again for my own statement of purpose, I found my attempts to implement traditional feedback control failed. However, by programming our own nonlinear algorithm, we achieve stable feedback. And again, this is something I discussed before, but quantify things if you can. So I said our $50 controller performed comparably to a $1,000 commercial controller, and we inferred a fidelity of like 0.99. Again, those numbers are good because it shows that those numbers stick with people. They're like, wow, $50 compared to $1,000. That's like a really big difference. So if you can quantify things, quantify things. And then once you're done, tie back what you did into your interests and your future work. And remember again, your intro paragraph is essentially a thesis, so you always want to refer back to it. So for an example, toward the end of the summer, I used single photon detectors to show we realized entangled pairs of photons. And during my summer there, I learned how to apply quantum information science to questions in fundamental physics. And you'll remember in my introduction, I mentioned fundamental physics. So here again is that link, because maybe throughout this paragraph you're asking, okay, this is really cool work, but what's the link to what you want to do? And this is exactly that. So describe your experiences, describe the challenges, then describe how it ties into your future interests. That's always what you want to do. So you do that for your body paragraphs, however many there are. And then next is a conclusion, or lastly is the conclusion. So the conclusion answers two main questions. Why that school / program, and what can you bring to the table? So this is where your research on schools comes into play. So this is where you should mention those specific professors that you want to work with. Again, like This is really, really, really important, and like you might like you can actually bold in the statement of purpose, like, and this is really a place where you should bold the names of those professors that you want to work with so that they stand out. Say like I want to work with Professor X who does all this cool research, um, or like and I want to work, or alternatively, I want to work with Professor Y who does this cool stuff, and I'm also very interested in the work of Professor Z who does yada yada yada. Like mention those three people that you want to work with, and when you answer the question of why that school/program, also talk about what really what makes that school special. Like, does it have a special academic program? Does it have a cool center? Does it have interesting collaborations? Does it do work with the national labs? Those are all things to consider. And if you talk about those things, it'll be very evident that you did your research and that like you're not just applying to the school because like, oh, it's prestigious or because it's like good for physics. You want to show that like, no, you've done your research and this school is actually a good fit for you. So all those things are really answers to the question of why. Okay. So then the last thing is you want to conclude by talking about what you can bring to the table. And this is pretty open-ended, like your expertise, your non-traditional experience, your work experience, your skills, anything that sets you apart or anything that like you think is exemplary is important to mention. So think creatively. Whatever you perceive as a weakness may actually be a strength. Because for me, like I've had like a bunch of like not non-traditional experiences, but I think a lot of my research experiences in undergrad were like very like different. Like they were in different things. So there was no clear connection between all those things. And I was like, oh my, I don't know how I can sell that. But then I just thought creatively about it. Like how can I spin this as a strength? And my idea was like, oh, like if I have diverse experiences, that's a good thing, right? Like I understand how different puzzle, like all these things can like are related, and this gives me like a wide set of skills. Like it gives me a big toolbox, so that like no matter what field I enter in grad school, like I can be prepared to tackle those questions there. So I think that's a good way to see things. Like people come up to me and they're like, oh, I had this experience or that experience that wasn't that great, or like, oh, I think it's part of my application this week. Just always think like, how can you spin that as a strength? Because you never want to admit like a weakness or want to admit that you just never want to admit those sorts of things in the application. You want to sell yourself, right? Like you want to brag about yourself. So take anything you perceive as bad and just spin that into a positive. And here's an example, which is my own conclusion. So I'm enthusiastic about the opportunity to pursue searches of new fundamental physics at Chicago. It's at the frontier of work in this field, and I'm drawn to its strong collaborative culture and small group size. I'm interested in these professors' work, blah, blah, blah. After speaking with them, I am confident I would thrive under their mentorship and expertise, and I believe I have the tools to conduct successful research as a member of these teams. With my skills, my interdisciplinary background, and my ability to learn independently, I'll be able to provide new ideas as a productive group member, and I look forward to continuing my interdisciplinary research and my academic journey at Chicago. So, here I brought up like, that thing I mentioned, right? Like my interdisciplinary background, which I thought was a weakness at first, but then I learned like, no, I can spin that into a strength. And I should also mention tone/confidence here. So confidence is, what is confidence? Confidence is really your tone. Like, how are you discussing the things that you did? Like don't put yourself down. Don't use filler phrases. Things like, when people write stuff like, I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to, people want to show like, yeah, they're grateful for like all these opportunities to do cool work. And that's good. That like, great gratitude is great, but like you want to sound confident and like just show like, I mean business. So like, and this was, I didn't feel super comfortable doing this, but one of my advisors was like, when you write your statement of purpose, like don't use those phrases. Don't use I hope. Instead, just use I will or I plan. And that can sound like a little too confident sometimes. Like in this previous slide, I said I look forward to continuing my journey at UChicago, right? Like that's a very bold statement, right? Like because traditionally you might say like, oh, I hope to have the opportunity to study at UChicago. Like no, I said like I look forward to continuing my journey at UChicago. But writing that way like leaves an impression because it gives the impression like you know what you're talking about, you're confident, like you believe in yourself and your work. So that's really how you want to like write things when you tackle the statement of purpose. And this is something I've mentioned a little bit before, but what if you did research you didn't like? What if it was not successful? So again, take anything that was bad, find a way to frame it positively. And even if you have a bad, because I think it really in almost any negative experience is probably a positive. Focus on what you learned. How does that experience set you apart from others? And what have you taken away from that for future experiences? Um, all things to think about and ask yourself when you're thinking about these experiences that maybe you had that you didn't like. Okay. So once you have these, all right, so that's all about the statement of purpose. I talked about it for quite some length, but that's because I think it's really important. And nobody really teaches you how to write like a statement of purpose. So I think having a strong statement of purpose is really important. So once you have these two documents, again, send them to your letter writers so that they can read them and review them. And aim to have your CV early in the year so that you can send them to faculty of interest. Aim to finish your statement of purpose at least a month before deadline so that you can send it to your recommenders and they can tailor their letters. And one other thing to discuss is the optional diversity statement. So I just said that, but it's optional. It doesn't affect admissions whatsoever. The way this comes into admissions is that like once you are admitted, they'll look at the diversity statement to see if they'll offer you like a fellowship or extra funding, that sort of thing. So again, it's optional. You really don't have to. And if you don't have too much time, like you can go without it. But I say it's worth it because you can draft one for one school and then like you can pretty much just submit the same thing for like each school, honestly. I say here it's really free form. Discuss what you've learned from your experiences and how you plan to give from your experience to that program. Like maybe in undergrad you were very into mentorship, you were very into outreach, that sort of thing. And those are experiences that you can bring to that program to like add to their diversity. Just as an example. So again, think creatively. Like whatever you feel about, like if you feel like you can bring diversity to the program in a particular way, just talk about that. So next part is really the application itself. Yeah, I mean, this is pretty much just biographical information, really. Like, they'll ask you like name, birthday, etc. I mean, but they do ask this very annoying thing, and I'll be honest when I tell you it is annoying. They'll ask you for a list of textbooks, like for all your class, like all your relevant STEM classes. So it's worth like just taking that information and saving it in a spreadsheet or a document so you just can copy and paste it. And if it's been a while since you've taken classes, you might have to go back to those old syllabi and find out like what was the textbook, what edition, etc. Like I'm not joking, they ask for all of that. So it's good to like take that information and save it somewhere just to copy and paste. And they'll ask you for your cumulative months of research, saying like, okay, counting like 20 hours of work like as like a half week and 40 hours of work as like a full week of work, like how many cumulative months of research. So, that's something you might want to calculate because if you work like a mix of full-time and part-time, you're gonna have to like do the math to figure that out. And again, just helps to like save this just to make your life easier. Any applications typically due in December and January, like the deadlines are like scattered throughout December and January. There's no like specific date in those 2 months that everybody asks for the applications. So yeah. And after submitting your application, it doesn't hurt. You really don't have to, but it doesn't hurt to follow up with faculty contacts and just say, hey, thank you like for talking with me a couple months ago and I submitted my application. It's a good way to like keep yourself in their minds. Yeah. So after this, you're not going to hear back for a bit. You're not going to hear back until February or March, maybe even April, but that's really late. It's typically going to be February or March. So the two things you don't want to do: don't email admissions officers asking for like the results. Because like they'll just like come out like at a random time in those 2 months. Honestly, don't go on admissions forms. Like the worst thing you can do is like just go on there and like everybody's posting like, oh my god, like I heard back, and then if you didn't hear back, you're like, okay, then I got rejected, right? Like it doesn't make you feel better to go on there. So I would just recommend like really do not go on there. And again, in the meantime, you can apply to jobs, or if you really want to, post back opportunities. And again, those can be backup or things that you can do for a gap year. If you really want to, I would say do those sorts of things. It again does not hurt. All right, so the last couple of things to discuss. Well, all right, interviews. So in the physical sciences, the interviews really stretch like a long period of time. They can be any time between late January and mid-March. I know for like other sorts of programs, they'll actually fly you out for interviews. But for physics, they never do that. They literally just talk to you online, like either by Zoom or Skype or phone. And it's really chill, basically. It's just a conversation. So I don't think you really have to stress about this. I would say just prepare an elevator pitch, like maybe 1 minute on like who you are, what are your interests, why that program. You just want to have those things prepared. And I think it doesn't hurt, again, to review your own research experiences in the past and see, like, what did you do? Because, sometimes they might ask you, like, okay, you had this one experience, tell us about it. And if you like haven't like thought about it in a while, you might be scrambling to talk about it. You're like, oh shoot, like I totally forgot what it was all about. So I think that it doesn't hurt to review those sorts of things that you did in the past, so that like if they ask you, you're prepared to talk about that. But again, this is really chill. Like all the ones I had were like just a conversation. It wasn't stressful. They didn't ask me any difficult questions. Okay, so that's all about the application and applying. But now when you've heard back, the difficult part is choosing programs. So there's a lot to say about this, but I'll just keep it brief. Really, I would say one of the most important, if not the most important part, is talking to the grad students. Because look, professors are going to try to sell you on the program. They'll be like, "Oh my gosh, it's great, it's great, it's great." But no professor's going to be like, "Yeah, the program here is not that great." The grad students are the ones who are going to tell you the truth. They're going to say, "Yeah, the program's great," or like, "No, the program's not great." Yes, this professor's good. No, this professor's not great. Don't work with them. So they'll tell you all the information you need, and they can tell you about stuff like relocation assistance, mentorship, like how well does the school or program support different career options or different interests. All good things to ask grad students about. And it's also good to follow up the faculty contacts that you made or that you mentioned in your application. See, are they taking any, you know, like are they taking students in the fall, or like how do you join the group, like have those conversations with them. And all the schools will like pay to fly you out on the visit programs. I didn't go on any because I mean like mine were like March 2020 basically, so like for obvious reasons they didn't happen. But I think they should be happening in like the next year and so on. And from what I hear, they're also always super fun. Like they take you out to restaurants and like like you get to meet everybody, the faculty, the grad students. Like it's a good time. And like you don't pay anything. So I would say like go on those because it's very difficult to make the decision without visiting, and that's something I actually had to do last year. But it worked out thankfully. But yeah, definitely go on those visits. They will really help in the decision making. Okay, so I think that's really it. That's the end of the presentation. I would say if you want more information, more advice, the CL website has really everything. Like on the GSMI page, there's like so much information. And I wrote this grad school guide that Jessica mentioned. I think she might have dropped it in the chat. I'm not totally sure, but otherwise it's on the CL website and you can find it there. And basically discusses a lot of stuff that I discussed here. Not too much new there. You can also email CL at their CL email. If you want any more advice. And if you want to talk to me specifically, you can email me at my UChicago email right here. So yeah, that's really it.
Yeah. Thank you, George, for that awesome presentation. You have a couple questions in the chat, and now for folks in the Zoom, if you want to ask questions, now is the time. I know there's a couple people on the YouTube live stream. If you have any questions there, type them in the YouTube chat box, and I'll tell George. Yeah, can you see the Q&A? Or
yeah, I can see the Q&A. So let me see. All right. So Miguel asks, if a person is graduating fall 2022 from a physics undergrad, when should they start messaging professors, studying for GRE, all the good stuff? Good question. I would say, really almost all of this is stuff that you shouldn't worry about. Okay, I would say study for the GRE in your junior year because, you can take the GRE like, okay, or the regular GRE you can take literally every single day of the year, like no joke. So because of that, like I would say I would recommend taking it in junior year, in the spring of junior year, because if you do well on it then great. The worst thing that I would say the worst thing is like you have to prepare all your application materials, take the GRE and the physics GRE in your senior fall, because like it's just like a lot of stress on top of like your classwork. So you want to like do that stuff a little bit early. So try to take the GRE in junior fall. Physics GRE, you can also take it in junior fall. if you want, because it's offered once in the spring and twice in the fall. But you really don't have to. I would say the majority of people just take it in September and October. So I would recommend you take it then. Message professors, not early summer, but like maybe you can start in maybe midsummer slash late summer. Because like if you message them too early, they're just gonna be like, look, you're asking me about positions, um, like literally a year and a half from now. Like I have no clue what the things are gonna look like. So you don't want to ask them too early. Yeah. And preparing the application materials, I would say the summer is a good time. And I just recommend that because summer is really the time when you're most free and have like the least commitments generally. Like no classes. Again, generally, like some people do take summer classes, of course, but I think it's a good time because if you do things early, that will just make your life easier. Yeah. All right. Should we mention what professor we would like to work with in our statement of purpose, even though we aren't sure if they're looking for new students? Yeah, I would say that. Like I would say that you want to talk to the professors beforehand to see if they are taking students. But even if you don't know, it's good to mention them because like, like I don't think they're gonna be like, yeah, don't take the student. You know what I mean? Like yeah, I think it only helps you. So yeah. That's a Patricia's question. Sorry, I didn't say that. Some person asked, does every letter of rec have to be written for a particular school or can you use one for multiple schools? So I think it depends on schools. Like some schools have like their own like annoying like format that they want like professors to use. But really, I think the majority of schools just are like, yeah, upload like a letter of recommendation and that's fine. So I think your letter writers can use the same letter of recommendation for multiple schools. So let me see. Let's see. There's some questions in the chat. Or like other.
It's just me dropping links and.
Oh, okay. Cool. Yeah. Okay. So I think I answered all the questions. I mean, if anybody has any more, like, hit me. So.
All right. We'll hang around for a bit. Let me check the YouTube, flipping back and forth. Any questions? Besides everything that you delivered so far, if you were to give advice to yourself when you were applying to grad school, do you have any words of wisdom?
Yeah, I would say like I think you just gotta be comfortable with the uncertainty of it all. Like I think it's a very uncertain process because I think like compared to undergrad, it's a little opaque, right? Like in undergrad, like the advice is like everybody gives you the same advice. It's like, okay, you just write like a good essay, and like you submit your SAT and like, just hope for the best, and like you hear back like, on March 31st, right? Like, for undergrad, it's very standardized. For grad school, like every school is different. Like they all do on different days. You don't know when you're going to hear back. Like, there's like a very personal aspect to it, which is like contacting faculty. And like navigating all that is like really difficult and like can make you just feel like, oh my gosh, like I don't know what my chances are. I don't know like what the future is going to look like. And that's really difficult. And I think this is easier said than done, but like you just kind of have to accept that uncertainty. And just take comfort in like the fact that the only thing in your hands is just preparing a strong application. Everything else is like sort of out of your hands. But like if you prepare a strong application, you can be rest assured you'll get in someplace, for sure. Like yeah, I think that's the advice I'd give myself.
So we have a question on the YouTube live channel. Do you have any tips? Oh, am I unmuted? Oh, I am.
Oh, I can hear you.
Okay, awesome. Do you have any tips for applying to grad schools outside the US? If you have information on that.
That's a good question. It really, not really. I mean, I know Canada is like similar to the US, but I mean, outside the US, it's like a very different system, right? Because in the US, like most PhD programs will give you like a master's along the way. Whereas outside the US, you have to like apply to a master's program, complete that, then you apply to like a separate PhD program. So it's a different process entirely. So I don't really have much, I know people who do that, right? Like they apply to PhDs abroad. And, I mean, I think it's worth looking into if you want to go abroad and like, the atmosphere is different. Like, you definitely get to see like what things are like outside of the US. I don't know, like people who go abroad, like I haven't heard like any of them have like a negative experience, honestly. So I would say if you really want to like go for it, the important thing is, get advice from like people who've actually done it because like it's different. So you don't want to like be led astray by like US centric advice, right? So definitely get advice from someone who like knows the system abroad.
Awesome. I have a partial answer. I'm not an international student myself, but in the chat, I'm gonna drop our international student guide as well as in the YouTube live stream. So
Okay.
I have folks in there. Um, Also, we had a webinar very recently for international students on how to apply to just STEM PhD programs. It is on our channel. It's already uploaded. So if you want to look at that presentation, that's up there. And it seems we have one more question in the chat for you, George.
Right. How many should I apply to? I mean, so I would say, all right. Somebody asked how many PhD programs should I apply to? I mean, it depends. I would say again, the average is like 8 to 15. Like as things get more selective, like which is like it's just like the general trend nowadays. People apply to more and more. Class sizes really depend. Like programs are all super super different. Some might accept like 10 people a year. Like I think my cohort at UChicago is like 30 to 40 people. So it really depends. It really does. Like should I expect to be accepted by 33% of the schools I apply to? That really depends on like where you're applying to, right? Because if you're applying to like very selective places, then maybe not 33%. If you apply to places that are less selective, then like more than 33%, right? Um, I don't know, and it depends on the person, depends on the year, etc. Like, and I know like my answers like just sounds like really unhelpful, but like given like how different all these programs are, it's generally pretty hard to talk about the programs in like a lot of generality, really. But I guess my answer to your question is really just you'll get into like at least a couple. Like if you prepare a strong application and like get it reviewed by people, then like you can expect to get in, for sure.
Yeah, there's a lot less, I think you mentioned before, there's a lot less control over what happens. And you just have to accept that there's a massive, circle of uncertainty going into this.
Yeah, and like I said, like last year was a very difficult year because the pandemic meant like school, like there were some schools, maybe not so much in physics, but like in other programs they're like, yeah, we're just not going to take any students this year, or like they're like we're going to take like single digit students, right? Like not that many. Um, again, I don't think that's going to happen this year, but I have no clue. Like I don't know what the funding situation is like this year, so I think it's something to be aware of for sure.
All right. If no one has any last questions, thank you again, George, for telling everyone about this and telling how to apply to physics PhD programs. I know I dropped a lot of links throughout the entire webinar, but if you missed any, or if you joined in late, or if you're on the YouTube live stream right now, all these links are going to be included when this entire webinar will be uploaded, since it is being recorded. Yeah, so don't worry if you missed anything. And awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. I wish everyone the best of luck. And I know by around this time next year, everyone will be starting their first year. Fingers crossed.
And good luck, everybody. And again, like if you have any questions, just feel free to contact CL or me. Like we're always happy to help.
All right, then. Bye. Thank you.
Take care, folks.